world obsessed with communication, a dangerous myth has taken root, that if people just understood you better, they would respect you more. That if you explain yourself clearly, apologize sincerely, justify your actions thoroughly, others will finally see your heart and trust your intent. But this is a fantasy. Not only is it false, it is destructive. Because the very act of explaining yourself exposes something you cannot afford to reveal, your need for validation, and in the eyes of the powerful, nothing is weaker than that. You are taught from childhood that being misunderstood is a problem, that you must always clarify, always soften, always make yourself palatable to others. But in the domain of power, the opposite is true. The more you explain, the more you shrink, the more you justify, the more you admit guilt. The more you speak, the more you give away your position. This is not about lying, it is about control, and the first control you must master is over your own tongue. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He warned rulers not to concern themselves with how they are perceived, but with how they are positioned. Not how they are judged, but how they are obeyed. In The Prince, he writes, "It is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them." Translation: power is not about reality, it's about perception, and perception is best manipulated in silence. You may think that by explaining yourself you are offering transparency, that you are inviting understanding, but what you are really doing is placing your power in the hands of others, giving them the right to decide your worth. And that is a gamble you cannot afford to make. Think about every moment in your life when you tried to explain your actions to someone who had already made up their mind. Did your words change them, or did they use your vulnerability to press harder, to dominate, to dismiss? That's the cost of explanation. It does not invite fairness, it invites leverage against you. Because when you explain, you expose, you reveal your logic, you share your emotions, you show the seams in your strategy, and anyone with half a predatory instinct knows exactly what to do with that information. Weaponize it. They learn what offends you, what you fear, what you regret, what keeps you up at night, and the more you offer up your interior world, the more they carve out your exterior authority. Now look around. Who do people follow? Who do they fear? Who do they, quote, imitate and obey? It is not the apologetic, not the over-explainer, not the people-pleaser. It is those who speak with finality, with simplicity, with decisive clarity. It is the man who says, "That's the decision," and leaves no room for debate. It is the woman who says no without justification. It is the leader who can walk out of a room and leave everyone adjusting to their absence. Because silence is not weakness, it is pressure. And pressure is power. Explanations kill pressure. They signal that you are unsure, that you are open to being negotiated with, that your boundaries are bendable, that your choices require permission. But power requires none. You are trained to believe that communication equals strength, but communication is only strength when it's strategic, when it's deliberate, when it's rare. The more often you explain yourself, the more others expect you to. And when that expectation is established, when your word is no longer final but conditional, you are no longer seen as a leader, you are seen as someone waiting for approval. But approval is never freely given, it's traded, and once you enter the marketplace of opinions, your authority is for sale. Cheap. The powerful do not negotiate their decisions in public, they do not issue disclaimers, they do not soften their edges for the comfort of others. They issue statements, they take action, and they let the results speak for them. They are not cruel, they are clear. And clarity, when it comes from silence, is interpreted as strength. Because people don't respect what they understand, they respect what they can't predict. They respect mystery, finality, immovable presence. The person who explains is trying to be understood. The person who commands is trying to be obeyed. Which are you? Look deeper. Why do you really feel the need to explain yourself? Because you want to be liked? Because you're afraid to be misread? Because you want to maintain harmony, keep doors open, avoid discomfort? Because somewhere inside you believe that being good means being transparent. But understand this, morality is not transparency, goodness is not permission, clarity does not require apology. When you apologize for being firm, for making a decision, for setting a boundary, for asserting your right to act, you are not being kind. You are being small. And smallness is contagious. Once others see you shrinking, they assume you will keep shrinking, and they will push further, demand more, until your integrity becomes a leash, until your decency becomes your downfall. So the Machiavellian steps back, watches, speaks when it matters, explains only when there is strategic value in doing so, never to gain sympathy, never to be liked, only to win. He does not react emotionally to criticism. He does not rush to defend his name. He lets his work, his presence, his moves speak for themselves. Because power, when real, does not need to explain itself. It simply is. If you're still explaining yourself, you are still asking for permission. If you're still apologizing for your clarity, you have not claimed your space. If you're still seeking to be understood by everyone, you have not chosen your mission. The mission comes first. Not how it looks, not how it feels, not how others react. This is part 1 of your awakening. Stop apologizing. Start observing. Your silence is the weapon they'll never see coming. Authority does not begin with credentials, charisma, or even competence. It begins with presence, with the unspoken gravity a person carries when they enter a room, and shift its energy without announcing themselves, without gesturing wildly for recognition, without offering a single unnecessary word. Because true power is not built on performance, but on a cultivated silence, so dense, so intentional, so sovereign that others adjust to it instinctively, almost involuntarily, as if pulled by a field they cannot describe but cannot deny. And yet, in this age of constant exposure and compulsive vulnerability, where every opinion is dissected in public and every stance must come with a disclaimer, most people have been conditioned to believe that authority grows by explanation, that if you carefully lay out your reasoning, justify your decisions, express your intentions, soften your tone, and ask for understanding, others will reward you with respect, alignment, and support. But what they fail to realize is that explanation is not a bridge to power, but a slow and steady erosion of it. A revelation of your internal scaffolding that transforms your solidity into transparency and your presence into a public draft, open to revision, correction, and ultimately dismissal. For every time you explain yourself not in strategy but in instinct, not for precision but for approval, not as a weapon but as a confession, you diminish the mystique that undergirds all influence. Because when people see too clearly what you are thinking, when they know exactly how you feel, when they can trace your logic and anticipate your moves, you are no longer a sovereign force in their perception. You are an exposed equation, and equations can be manipulated, deconstructed, either ignored, especially by those who never respected your authority in the first place. This is the paradox that few grasp until it's too late. While transparency may be virtuous in theory, in practice it often invites control. Because once people believe they understand you, not your actions but your wiring, they begin to build strategies around your predictability. They test your boundaries, exploit your kindness, mirror your apologies, and then use your integrity as a leash, gently tugging on the very principles you exposed, until your leadership becomes their playground and your strength becomes their toy. And the moment you realize that your well-meaning explanation has become a negotiation, that your thoughtful clarification has become a debate, that your strategic transparency has morphed into an invitation for others to question, revise, or delay your decisions, you will see with brutal clarity that authority does not die in fire, it dies in conversation. Not the meaningful kind, but the kind where your every word becomes a breadcrumb, leading people away from your presence and into their power. Look at history, not through the lens of myth, but through the mechanics of actual power, and ask yourself, when did Caesar ask for permission? When did Napoleon ask for understanding? When did Churchill, Mandela, or even Lincoln interrupt their momentum to poll the crowd and explain their next move to every skeptic, critic, or coward pretending to be a concerned observer? They didn't, because they understood something that eludes the soft leaders of today. That authority is not explained, it is asserted, it is not defended, it is declared, it is not reasoned into existence, it is positioned, embodied, and enforced. And that once you enter the theater of justification, your crown begins to tilt, because the moment you speak as if your decisions require external approval, you have already handed over the sovereignty you once possessed, and all that remains is performance. And the crowd, hungry for weakness, trained to smell doubt, eager to cut down what stands above, will not applaud your explanation, they will devour it. They will not praise your vulnerability, they will study it. They will not offer you grace, they will weaponize the very words you shared in trust. Because what the naive moralist sees as honesty, the Machiavellian operator sees as leverage. So you must ask yourself with ruthless honesty, when you explain your decision, is it truly for clarity or is it because you are afraid of being judged? When you apologize for your boundary, is it because it was wrong or because you need others to like you? When you soften your conviction, add a disclaimer, offer a long justification, is it because you are leading or because you are secretly still seeking permission to exist with force? Because every time you explain yourself without intention, every time you clarify when you should have concluded, every time you choose relatability over authority, you are not just losing control of the conversation, you are training people to expect your compliance, to treat your words not as declarations but as drafts, and worst of all, to believe that your power is negotiable, revisable, and ultimately optional. And there is no faster death for authority than optionality. Now, some will claim that silence is cold, that certainty is arrogance, that a refusal to explain oneself is a form of disengagement or even abuse. But these are the words of those who do not understand power, who cannot hold ambiguity, who need constant comfort and emotional explanation to feel safe, and who, when given an ounce of your reasoning, will demand gallons of it until you are no longer a strategist but a servant. Apologizing for your vision, justifying your clarity, diluting your presence until your throne becomes a stool. The Machiavellian does not fall into this trap, not because he is cruel, but because he is calibrated. He speaks when it is useful, he clarifies when it is precise, he explains only when it serves a function greater than appeasement, and when he does so, it is not to justify himself, but to shift a room, to confuse an enemy, to redirect attention, or to draw out weakness, but never to confess, never to be liked, and never to beg for understanding, because he knows that understanding is not the foundation of authority. Perception is, and perception, when shaped correctly, bends others without a word. So remember this, the more you explain, the more they require it, the more you justify, the more they question, the more you apologize, the more they forget your strength and remember only your concession. And soon you are no longer followed, you are managed. No longer feared, you are doubted. No longer respected, you are pitied. And when that moment comes, when you feel your voice tightening, your confidence slipping, your authority dissolving into dialogue, do not speak louder, do not offer more context, do not plead for understanding. Go quiet, go still, go sovereign, because power does not explain, it demonstrates. And the moment you forget that is the moment your influence begins to decay, not with drama, but with every unnecessary word you believed would save you. Power, when truly understood, is not about control through clarity, but about dominance through opacity. For the man who is misunderstood yet unmoved terrifies far more than the man who is understood yet persuadable. And in this paradox lies the root of one of the most devastating weapons in the arsenal of the strategist, the deliberate use of misunderstanding, not as an error to be corrected, but as a condition to be leveraged. Most people spend their lives trying to be seen correctly, heard accurately, interpreted fairly. But those who move systems, shape empires, and bend public perception to their will have long known that the pursuit of being understood is not only a trap, it is a surrender. Because the moment you make your internal clarity dependent on external recognition, you have submitted to a game you cannot win, a game in which your worth, your identity, and your decisions are placed on the auction block of public consensus, where they will be distorted, diminished, and repackaged until you no longer recognize your own intent beneath the weight of interpretation. But the Machiavellian does not fear being misread. In fact, he invites it. He designs for it. He engineers his ambiguity with surgical precision because he understands that people do not seek truth. They seek confirmation. And once they believe they have decoded your actions, once they think they have figured you out, they begin to operate on assumptions. And assumptions, once calcified, become blind spots, which means that the very misunderstanding your enemies cling to can become the smokescreen behind which your real work is done. Consider how often power is lost not by lack of strength but by excess of exposure, by revealing too soon what could have been used later, by clarifying too completely what should have remained obscure, by explaining away the sharp edges that gave your presence its shape. And in this constant hemorrhaging of intent, in this compulsive desire to be seen as authentic, most people give away their leverage before the battle even begins, because they've handed their rivals a map of their thinking, and the moment someone can predict your moral compass, your emotional trigger points, and your strategic pattern, you are no longer a threat, you are a forecast, and forecasts are managed, not feared. But if you learn to operate within the terrain of selective opacity, if you train yourself to let misunderstanding fester, not from negligence but from intent, then you will discover a terrifying power, the power to dictate narratives not by correcting them but by ignoring them, the power to allow others to build illusions about you while you quietly orchestrate your real influence in silence, moving beneath the noise, stepping around their projections, and capitalizing on their need to explain what you refuse to confirm. It is here that the game becomes psychological, for once you show that you are indifferent to being understood, that you will not flinch in the face of distortion, that you are not seduced by the need to be perceived as kind, fair, or rational, then those who seek to control you through accusation, shame, or social pressure lose their grip, because their power was always rooted in your reaction, and when your reaction disappears, when you offer no emotional fuel, no defensive posture, no verbal clarification, then you transform from a participant in their theater to a ghost behind their curtain, immune to their scripts, untouchable by their conclusions, and perhaps most importantly, utterly ungovernable. This is why the most dangerous man is not the one who yells back, it is the one who listens in silence and smiles without confirming anything, because his silence is not agreement and not surrender, it is calibration. It is cold observation. It is the act of allowing others to build the trap they believe will ensnare him while he carefully, methodically, and invisibly builds the fire they will not see until they are already inside it. Nowhere is this more evident than in institutions where perception becomes currency, in politics, in business, in culture, where image is often weaponized against truth, and where the one who controls interpretation, not action, becomes the architect of outcome. And in such a landscape, those who rush to explain themselves are simply supplying ammunition to those who traffic in optics, while those who refuse to play the game of overexposure become unpredictable. And in that unpredictability, they become immune. Because when you no longer fear being misunderstood, you can begin to craft misunderstanding as a strategic mirror, a tool that reflects what others want to see, what they fear, what they project, and in that reflection you learn everything, what they assume, what they dismiss, what they fail to verify. And as their minds wrap around their own invention of you, you learn exactly where to place pressure, where to withdraw, and where to strike. And if you think this is manipulation, think again. This is survival in a world where those who seek to destroy you do not need facts, they only need your cooperation in proving their theory, and so long as you keep talking, clarifying, apologizing, explaining, you are handing them material, you are giving them structure, you are building their narrative while weakening your own. Not through truth, but through visibility. So the Machiavellian understands the art of strategic vagueness, the science of saying just enough to suggest depth but never so much as to become dissectable, of revealing movement without revealing motive, of displaying action while concealing architecture. Because once your blueprint is visible, your fortress is already compromised, and the battlefield becomes theirs, not yours. And yet, those addicted to the virtue of clarity will scoff. They will cry out that honesty is the foundation of trust, that transparency is the soul of justice, that to mislead is to betray. But what they fail to realize is that in a world where bad actors exploit every truth given freely, the highest betrayal is often against yourself, and the deepest honesty is the restraint not to speak. Therefore, misunderstanding, if properly wielded, is not a flaw to fix, but a fog to weaponize. It is the unseen curtain that shields the strategist from the sniper, the barrier that blocks enemy aim while allowing your movements to unfold uninterrupted, because in a landscape where everyone seeks clarity, the one who thrives in complexity becomes the one who governs the pace, the tone, and the perception of power itself. So do not be afraid to be misunderstood. Fear instead the seduction of being known too well. For those who know you too well can trap you with your own principles, strangle you with your own words, and dismantle you with your own convictions. And while you argue your innocence, they claim the throne, not because they were more righteous, but because they knew how to use the fog while you stood screaming in the light. And in this world, brutal, fast, indifferent to virtue, and obsessed with optics, the one who allows himself to be misunderstood on purpose, the one who operates beneath interpretation, the one who never explains but always advances, he is not only feared, he is free. In a world addicted to noise, where every platform demands opinion, every conversation insists on reaction, and every provocation expects a reply, the rarest, sharpest, most subversive form of power is silence. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of weakness or confusion, but the deliberate, tactical, highly charged silence of someone who could speak, who has the words, who knows the answers, but chooses instead to say nothing, and in doing so, says everything. Silence, when wielded by the unprepared, is a void, but when wielded by the prepared, by the disciplined, by the strategist who understands that words, once released, cannot be recalled, cannot be reshaped, cannot be unfelt by their targets or unheard by their enemies, silence becomes not an empty space, but a pressure chamber, a terrain of calculated ambiguity, a crucible in which others begin to implode under the weight of their own assumptions, projections, and desperate need to be validated by a response you will never give them. The truth is that most people do not speak because they have something to say. They speak because they cannot bear to be misread. They speak because they are uncomfortable with tension, with silence, with the eyes of others on them, without a script to deflect the gaze. And so they speak to escape the pressure, to explain, to clarify, to dilute, to smooth. But the Machiavellian, the operator, the architect of power, learns early that pressure is not something to escape. It is something to generate, something to direct, something to own. And that the most efficient way to own pressure is not through confrontation, but through the stillness that unnerves everyone who expects a show. When a weak man is silent, he disappears, but when a strong man is silent, he multiplies, because people project onto silence whatever they most fear or desire, and in that projection they reveal themselves. They uncover their own weaknesses, they show their motives, and they begin to move not based on your words, but based on your presence. Or, more precisely, your unreadability. And this unreadability, this refusal to let others decode your mind, your limits, your reasoning, becomes the backbone of strategic leverage. Because the moment people can no longer predict you, they can no longer prepare for you, and when they cannot prepare for you, they begin to hesitate, and hesitation is the soil from which power grows. Silence is not passivity, it is positioning. It is the decision to let your inaction become more terrifying than any action you might take. It is the decision to create space, not for others to speak, but for others to falter, to panic, to break their own rhythm, because they are waiting for a response that will never come, a cue that remains suspended in the air, a signal that remains encrypted in your stillness. And the more they reach for your confirmation, your correction, your clarification, the more they expose their dependence on your voice to feel stable. And when that dependence is revealed, you own the tempo. Consider the courtroom where the silent defendant unnerves the jury, the negotiation table where the calm executive allows the silence to stretch until the other side folds under its weight, the military commander who speaks only once and yet sets the rhythm of an entire battalion, not because he micromanages every move, but because his restraint imbues every order with gravity. Power does not live in repetition, it lives in finality. And finality is a function of silence. When you speak rarely, every word becomes an event. When you speak slowly, every syllable carries gravity. When you speak last, your voice lands like a verdict. This is why the disciplined strategist does not seek to be heard, he seeks to be felt. Not through volume, but through weight. Not through participation, but through presence. And the less he says, the more others listen. Because the man who speaks little, but speaks with precision, with timing, with calm certainty, becomes the one whose silence is no longer just absence, it is architecture. It shapes the room. It creates an invisible scaffolding around which others build their reactions, their stories, their fears, and that scaffolding is power. But this silence must be earned. You cannot simply fall quiet and expect influence. You must first have established the credibility that your silence signals calculation, not confusion, that your stillness is not a stall, but a stance, that your pause is not paralysis, but preparation. Because when your silence is respected, it becomes magnetic. When it is misunderstood, it becomes ignored. So the work is not to be quiet for its own sake, but to be quiet after you have made it clear that your voice, when it comes, is final, that your input, when it arrives, is consequential, that your presence, even without sound, is a fulcrum around which outcomes pivot. This is how the strategist begins to separate himself from the talkers, from the explainers, from the loud, frantic men who mistake energy for authority. He does not need to be loud because his decisions echo louder than any words ever could. And those decisions, rooted in thought, steeped in calculation, unleashed without warning, cut through the fog of performative dialogue like a blade forged in silence, sharpened in solitude, and deployed without explanation. Silence, in this sense, is the proof of self-sufficiency. It is the visible expression of internal sovereignty. It is the signal that your power is not drawn from consensus, not validated by applause, not maintained by persuasion, but is self-generated, self-directed, and self-protecting. So when others call for you to explain, you wait. When they demand an answer, you watch. When they provoke you with narratives, with insults, with rumors, with pressure, you smile, not with malice, but with understanding, because they have shown their hand, and you have not even touched your cards. That is leverage, not noise, not volume, but constant declarations of your worth or rightness or nobility, but a silence so grounded, so intentional, so unshakable that it becomes gravity. And gravity, once felt, does not need to be explained. There comes a moment, inevitable and absolute, when all the watching, the waiting, the silence, the tension, the invisible scaffolding of perception you have so carefully engineered must give way to the single force that defines all true power: execution. Not the noisy, desperate kind that seeks applause or approval, but the cold, deliberate, surgically precise kind that transforms potential into consequence, theory into terrain, strategy into history. For all the rhetoric around leadership, for all the noise about vision, confidence, authenticity, and alignment, what separates the performer from the force, the philosopher from the ruler, the idealist from the conqueror, is not how they think or even what they believe, but whether they can move, decisively, silently, and without seeking permission. When the window opens and the world, still caught in its distractions, has not yet understood that the ground has shifted beneath it, because while the masses obsess over being seen, over being liked, over saying the right thing at the right time to the right audience with the right tone and the right caption, the strategist waits, not for attention but for opening, not for affirmation but for alignment. And when the variables converge, when silence has done its work, when confusion has served its purpose, when misunderstanding has masked intention, he acts, and in acting renders all explanations irrelevant. And this is the final betrayal of the myth of goodness, that clarity, morality, sincerity, or even excellence alone are enough to secure results, when in fact history, not the fiction we are told as children, but the brutal architecture of empire, movement, revolution, and survival, shows with pitiless consistency that those who shape the outcome are not those who are most deserving, most virtuous, or most right, but those who were most prepared to act when it mattered most, with the least hesitation, the most leverage, and the clearest will. Execution, in the Machiavellian sense, is not movement for its own sake, not activity disguised as agency, not the frantic busyness of the insecure, but a form of dominance grounded in timing, terrain, and intentionality, where every move is already calculated, where every word has already been weaponized, where every silence has already softened resistance, so that when the action arrives, it is not debated, it is not doubted, it is not questioned, it is simply absorbed by a world that was too slow to defend against it. You must understand that power is not what you have, it is what others perceive you can do, and perception is built in the dark but confirmed in the light in the moment of execution, when you act with such clarity, such finality, such absence of hesitation, that your former ambiguity is no longer interpreted as indecision but as depth, and your silence is no longer seen as passivity but as preparation. And suddenly, all the whispers, all the misreadings, all the projections collapse into a single realization. This was never weakness, this was patience. The man who executes without explaining has crossed a threshold most never reach, because to act without apology, to move without justification, to impose without softening your edge, is not a lack of conscience. It is the expression of one sharpened by experience, focused by intent, and hardened by the cold knowledge that in the end, it is not what you mean that shapes the world, but what you do, and how relentlessly you do it when the clock runs out and no one else is ready. This is why the strategist does not overthink when it is time to move, because he has already thought in advance. He does not seek counsel when the die must be cast, because he has already studied the terrain. He does not hope the world will understand his action, because he has already accepted that true leadership means acting in defiance of comfort, and that legacy, real legacy, is not built on the applause of now, but on the architecture of what remains long after the noise has faded. So he executes. Quietly, without announcement, without dramatics. He makes the call, he signs the deal, he closes the door, he walks away, he redraws the line. He says no and means it. He says yes and never explains why. And in the aftermath, as others scramble to understand, to interpret, to retroactively justify or condemn, his silence returns, not because he has nothing to say, but because he already said it with movement, and movement needs no punctuation. This is the paradox that the weak never accept. that the most decisive people are not the loudest, not the most expressive, not the most visible, but the ones who built for years in silence, who let the world underestimate them, misread them, dismiss them, until the moment they could no longer be denied. They do not win by accident, they win by preparation, they win by control, and they win by waiting for the moment when execution would no longer feel like a choice, but like gravity, irreversible, inevitable, undeniable. And when that moment arrives, when the room still waits for someone to say the right thing, when the committee still debates the right timing, when the crowd still argues about optics, the strategist moves, and by the time the others look up, the game has already changed, the terrain has already shifted, and the silence that once concealed him now reveals the truth, that the one who seemed most absent was always the one holding the wire. So do not apologize for your discipline. Do not explain your delay. Do not justify your presence. Build in silence, fortify in shadows, train your instincts like a weapon, and when the moment comes, not if, but when, act not with desperation, not with explanation, not with noise, but with precision. Because in the end, all your potential, all your clarity, all your positioning, all your silence means nothing unless you execute. Power does not remember what you almost did. It remembers what you dared to do.